My son wrote, "Dad, celebrate Christmas on your own this year. We need space as a family." His wife added, "Maybe someday you'll earn the right to sit with us." I replied, "Thanks for letting me know. I'll cancel all payments today." An hour later, 14 missed calls. Let me tell you exactly what happened. All of it. Because most people who hear a story like this only get the headline, the dramatic part, the part that fits in a caption or a comment section. They don't get the years that led up to it. They don't get the Tuesday night I spent alone in my kitchen doing math on a legal pad. They don't get the burned biscuits or the Saturday morning my son showed up at my door looking like he hadn't slept in 2 weeks. They just get the headline. I'm gonna give you everything. I want to start with the night it happened, because the night it happened is where everything that had been building for 4 years finally came to the surface. And I want to be honest with you from the beginning. I am not a perfect man. I have made mistakes in this story, real ones, the kind that take years to understand. So if you're looking for a simple villain, you might be disappointed. But if you want the truth of what happened between a father and his son, and what it cost both of them to get to something real, keep listening. It was a Tuesday night in early December. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd just watched the evening news and was reheating leftover soup from the night before. That's the kind of detail you remember when something changes. The microwave clock said 7:42. The soup was chicken and rice. I'd made too much of it on Sunday because I always make too much when I cook for myself, and I haven't figured out how to stop doing that even after 6 years of living alone. My phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up without thinking about it, the way you do when you're waiting for nothing in particular. The message was from my son. "Dad, celebrate Christmas on your own this year. We need space as a family." I read it once, put the phone down, took my soup out of the microwave, and picked the phone back up and read it again. There was a second message from my daughter-in-law. "Maybe someday you'll earn the right to sit with us." I set the phone face down on the counter. I stood there for a while, long enough that my soup got cold again. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, I could see the neighbor's Christmas lights through the kitchen window, the same ones he puts up every year the weekend after Thanksgiving without fail. Red, green, white, blinking in that slow, predictable pattern. The street looked exactly the way it always looks in December. Cheerful, ordinary, like nothing had just happened. But something had just happened. I picked the phone back up. I looked at both messages one more time. I thought about what I wanted to say in response. The long version, the short version, the calm version, the version I would have been proud of. I thought about calling. I thought about a lot of things. And then I opened my banking app. Not because I was angry, I want to be clear about that, because people assume that what I did next was a reaction, an emotional snap, the thing you do when you're furious and you want to hurt someone. It wasn't. I wasn't furious. I was something quieter than that. I was tired in a way I hadn't fully let myself feel before that moment. Tired of a dynamic that had been building for years. Tired of funding a life I wasn't allowed to be part of. Tired of writing checks as a substitute for conversation. The message my son sent didn't make me angry. It made something click into place, like when a room finally makes sense once you move the furniture. I opened the banking app and I started canceling things. Their mortgage first. Let me back up and explain the mortgage, because it requires some context. My son and his wife had been renting an apartment for the first few years of their marriage. Then in 2021, they decided they wanted to buy a house. They found one they liked, a 3-bedroom place in a suburb about 40 minutes from me. Good school district, nice yard. And when they went to apply for a mortgage, the lender came back and told them my son didn't qualify. His credit score was too low. He'd had a rough stretch in his late 20s, some debt he hadn't managed well, a credit card that went to collections, a car loan he'd been late on more than once, the kind of history that follows you. His wife's income alone wasn't enough to qualify for the amount they needed, so they came to me. I want to tell you that I thought about it carefully, that I had a long conversation with my son about whether this was a good idea, about what it would mean, about what the arrangement would look like going forward. I want to tell you I set clear expectations. I didn't. I said yes the same week they asked. I said yes because my wife had died 3 years earlier, and I was still trying to figure out how to be part of my son's life without her, as the bridge between us. And saying yes felt like connection. It felt like being useful. It felt like love, even if it was a different shape than love is supposed to take. I put my name on the mortgage. Just mine. Not his, not his wife's. Mine. My credit. My income verification. My risk. The loan was in my name. The deed was in my name. They moved in, and I started covering the monthly payment. $2,600 a month. Not a loan between us. Not something they were paying me back for. Just me. Paying the mortgage on a house I didn't live in for a family that called it theirs. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself Pauline, my wife, would have done the same thing. She loved my son completely, in that way she had of loving people that I always admired and never quite managed to replicate. After she was gone, I think I tried to love him the way she would have, and Pauline's love was consistent and unconditional in a way that mine wasn't naturally. So I substituted money for consistency. I wrote checks and told myself it was the same thing. It wasn't, but I didn't understand that yet. So there I was in December, standing in my kitchen with my cold soup and my phone, canceling a mortgage autopay that had been running for 3.5 years. I pressed the button. A dialog box appeared. "Are you sure you want to cancel this scheduled transfer?" I pressed confirm. Then I moved to the car payments. This also requires some explanation. My son's car situation had always been complicated by his credit history. When he needed a replacement vehicle a couple of years into the marriage, he couldn't get a good interest rate on his own. I co-signed the loan loan to get him a lower rate. Then somewhere along the way, just paying it myself became easier than the back and forth of him reimbursing me, and that arrangement had just continued. $480 a month. His wife's car was a little different. She'd wanted something newer. She said the car she had wasn't reliable enough and she worried about the kids. I understood that. I didn't argue. I just added the payment. $390 a month. Both gone now. I went through each one and canceled the auto pay. It took maybe 4 minutes, then the credit card. This one I'll say a little more about because it's the one that, in retrospect, I should have looked at more carefully a long time before I did. When they'd first moved into the house, there were household setup costs. Things you need when you move somewhere new. Curtains, small appliances, things for the kids' rooms. My daughter-in-law mentioned it was adding up and she was worried about keeping up with it all. I told her I'd add her to one of my credit cards for the transition period just to cover the initial expenses. The transition period lasted 3.5 years. I looked at the statements periodically, not as carefully as I should have. The charges were never anything dramatic, nothing that would have made any single statement look alarming. But if I sat down and actually added up what had flowed through that card over time, I would have seen that it averaged somewhere between $800 and $1,200 a month. Restaurants, home goods, clothing, things that were described in my own head as household necessities, things that, looking back, were just lifestyle spending. Her lifestyle on my credit card for years. I called the number on the back of the card and reported it lost. The customer service rep was polite and efficient. She confirmed the card would be deactivated within the hour and asked if I'd like a replacement sent. I said yes to my address. She confirmed the last 4 digits of the card I wanted deactivated. I confirmed them. She said the new card would arrive in 3 to 5 business days. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with the legal pad I kept in the drawer by the refrigerator, the one I use for grocery lists and occasional notes, and I wrote down every number. Mortgage, $2,600 a month. His car, $480 a month. Her car, $390 a month. The credit card averaged $1,000 a month. A gym membership I'd added my son to during the pandemic and never thought to remove, $65 a month. 2 streaming subscriptions that had, at some point, gotten consolidated onto my payment method without anyone specifically asking or mentioning it. About $35 a month combined. I added it up. Then I added it up again because the number seemed too clean, too round, and I wanted to be sure. $64,200 a year. I sat with that number for a long time. I'm a retired structural engineer. I spent my career calculating loads, how much weight a structure can bear, where the stress points are, what happens when you exceed the tolerance of a given material over time. I've always been comfortable with numbers. Numbers don't argue with you. They don't have feelings. They just sit there and tell you the truth. $64,000 a year was the truth. I poured my cold soup down the drain, made a new cup of coffee, which I also didn't drink, and sat at my kitchen table looking at the legal pad. Outside, the neighbors' Christmas lights kept blinking. The house was quiet. It's always quiet now. In a way, it wasn't when Pauline was alive. She moved through a house differently than I do. She filled rooms without trying. I thought about her for a while, sitting there. I thought about what she would have made of all this. She would have seen it coming years before I did. She always saw things more clearly when it came to people. She'd have had a conversation with my son that I never managed to have. Direct and warm and impossible to deflect. She had a way of saying hard things that made people feel cared for instead of criticized. I never learned how to do that. I was the one who avoided things and hoped they'd work themselves out. Well, here we were. I didn't respond to the text that night. I didn't call. I went to bed around 10, which is earlier than usual, and I slept better than I expected to. Not well exactly, but solidly, like something had released. In the morning, I called my attorney. His name isn't important, but he's a man I've worked with for 15 years. He handled my estate documents after Pauline died, updated my will, helped me navigate a property dispute I had with a neighbor years ago. He's practical and unflappable in the way that good attorneys are. When I called him at 8 in the morning and told him I needed to talk through some financial arrangements and possibly a property situation, he didn't ask why or what happened. He just said, "Come in Thursday." I went in Thursday. I laid out the situation clearly. The mortgage in my name. The fact that my son and daughter-in-law had been living in the house for over 3 years with no formal agreement, no rent, no repayment arrangement. The message I'd received Tuesday evening. I told him I wanted to understand my options regarding the property. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked some clarifying questions. Was my son's name on the deed? No. On the mortgage? No. Had there been any written agreement about his occupancy or my intent to transfer the property to him? No. He made notes. He told me that since the property was entirely in my name and there was no formal tenancy agreement in place, I had broad latitude. I told him I wanted to send a formal notice of my intent to sell the property. He nodded like this was a routine request, which for him it probably was, and said he'd draft something. The letter went out by certified mail on Friday. It was formal and clear. It stated that I intended to list the property for sale, that the current occupants would need to make arrangements for alternative housing, and that they would be given 60 days from the date of the letter to vacate. It was polite. It contained no accusations and no explanation beyond the bare legal facts. My son called me that Friday at 7:52 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was eating toast and watching the birds at the feeder in my backyard. Another habit I'd picked up since retiring, something Pauline had started and I'd continued without really thinking about it. His name came up on my phone and I looked at it for a moment and I let it ring. I wasn't ready. Not because I was afraid of the conversation conversation, but because some conversations deserve more than a half-eaten piece of toast and a kitchen counter. I wanted to be settled when we talked. I wanted to be in a chair, thinking clearly, with nowhere to be. He called again at 8:15. His wife called at 8:47, then 8:48. My son again at 9:02, 9:03, 9:04. Then a text. Dad, we got a letter from a lawyer. What is going on? Please call me. Then another text from his wife this time. This is incredibly cruel. I hope you're proud of yourself. I finished my breakfast, washed my plate, put on my coat, and went for my morning walk, which I do most days regardless of weather. Doctor's orders, 45 minutes minimum, something about cardiovascular health that I've chosen to actually follow because I'm not interested in arguing with my doctor. The neighborhood was cold and gray. Some of the inflatable Christmas decorations in yards along the street had deflated overnight from the cold. There was a Santa lying flat across someone's lawn like he'd had a very difficult evening. I noticed it but didn't really register it. My mind was somewhere else. I got home to 14 missed calls, 7 from my son, 4 from his wife, 3 from her mother, a woman I'll call Ellen, who I had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in the entire duration of my son's marriage, and who apparently felt this was the moment to close that particular distance. There was also a voicemail from a man named Bryce, apparently a cousin of my daughter-in-law's, someone whose existence I had not previously been made aware of, who told me in a very confident tone that I was being vindictive and that family didn't treat each other this way. I sat in my armchair for a moment. The house was quiet. The birds were back at the feeder. I thought about what Pauline used to say when people overstepped. She had a phrase, not an insult. She wasn't built for insults. Just a quiet, firm observation. She'd say, "You've wandered into a room that isn't yours." She said it pleasantly. It landed like a door closing. I thought about Bryce, whom I had never met, leaving me a voicemail about family values. I thought about Pauline. I thought she would have had something very precise to say about that. I called my son at 2 in the afternoon. I waited until then because I knew his wife would be out picking up the kids from school, and I wanted to talk to my son alone, not to ambush him or prevent him from having support, but because there were things I needed to say that needed to land directly, without being filtered through their dynamic in real time. He answered before the first ring finished. "Dad, what is happening?" I told him I was glad he picked up. I asked him if he was somewhere he could talk. He said yes. His voice was tight, not angry exactly, more like someone who has been frightened and is now trying to present as something else. I told him calmly what I had done. I canceled the mortgage auto pay, the car payments, the credit card. I told him I had also initiated a review of my estate documents and that he should be aware I had spoken to my attorney about the property, which he already knew because of the letter. Silence. Then, why? Because of the message on Tuesday, I said. Because your wife added to it. Because when I added up what I contribute to your household every month and compared it to being told I haven't earned a seat at a family Christmas table, those two things don't sit together in a way I can accept anymore. More silence. Longer. Then, Dad, you can't sell the house. We have 2 kids. Where are we supposed to go in the middle of a school year? I understand the concern, I said. And I want to be clear. I have not canceled your son's school expenses, and I'm not going to do that mid-year because he's a child and this isn't his doing. When it comes to the kids, I'm going to try to do right by them because they didn't write that message and they don't deserve to absorb the consequences of it. A long pause. I'm not trying to hurt anyone, I told him. I'm stopping an arrangement that stopped making sense. You've told me I'm not family, so I'm adjusting my behavior accordingly. His voice got quieter. Dad, I didn't really think about how that message sounded. I know you didn't, I said, and I told him I'd give them 60 days, which was more than the legal minimum, and that I was willing to help him understand his financial options because I knew a great deal about real estate and money if he wanted to use that resource. But I was not going to continue funding a household in which I had been told I was not welcome. He said Diane is going to lose her mind. I imagine she's already working on that, I said. He didn't have a response to that. We sat in silence for a moment, and then he said quietly that he needed some time. I told him that was fine. I told him I loved him, and I meant it without qualification, which is not always easy to do in the middle of a hard conversation, but I managed it. He didn't say it back. I didn't expect him to, and I wasn't going to hold it against him. People say it when they're ready. We hung up. The week that followed was genuinely unpleasant. I won't dress it up as anything other than what it was. Ellen left me 2 more voicemails. The second one was tearful, and the third was accusatory, and I listened to both of them and deleted them. Bryce sent me a Facebook message, which I did not open beyond the preview. A friend of my son's, a man who'd been at my son's wedding and who I'd met maybe 5 times, called me and said he thought I was making a mistake. I thanked him for his perspective and told him this wasn't something he needed to be involved in. He seemed surprised by that. I think he'd expected either a fight or an apology. I gave him neither. I called my attorney twice that week to make sure the paperwork was in order. I called my accountant to review the financial implications of the property sale. I had 2 conversations with a real estate professional I'd worked with years ago. I still have connections from my engineering years when I was adjacent to a lot of property development to get a sense of what the house would list for and how long it might sit on the market. I kept my routines: morning walk, breakfast, an hour of reading in the afternoon. I had been working through a biography of the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park and dozens of other public spaces across the country. He spent decades building things for public use that he would never personally benefit from. He worked himself to exhaustion on projects whose fruits he would not live to see. I found that strangely comforting that week, in a way I didn't try to analyze too carefully. eventually. My neighbor across the street noticed something was off. His name is Bernard, a retired high school principal, a man in his mid-70s who is perceptive in the particular way of someone who has spent decades managing teenagers. He didn't ask questions. He just showed up one evening with a casserole his wife had made, knocked on my door, and said his wife had made too much and did I want some. We sat in my kitchen and talked about the Olmsted book and about a pothole at the end of the block that the city had been promising to fix for 2 years. He didn't pry. He didn't perform concern. He just sat there and was present, which is sometimes all you need from another person. That was one of the better evenings of that month. Let me go back to something because I think I glossed over it and it matters. The gym membership. I know it sounds small. $65 a month is not the number that jumps out when you're looking at a legal pad that says $64,000 a year. But I keep coming back to it because it's the detail that tells you the most about how these things work. How the quiet accumulation of small assumptions becomes something you can barely see until you're standing outside it. I added my son to my gym membership during the pandemic. He'd lost his job in the spring of 2020, which was genuinely difficult. A lot of people lost work that year, and his particular industry got hit hard. He was home all day with a new baby and a wife who was also stressed and a world that felt like it was coming apart. And I thought getting him access to a gym might help. Exercise helps. Routine helps. It was $65. I didn't think about it as a permanent thing. I just did it. And then months passed. His situation improved. He found new work. Life stabilized. The pandemic ended in the way pandemics end, gradually and then suddenly, with a lot of arguments about when exactly it was over. And the gym membership just kept running because I didn't cancel it and nobody thought to ask me to. And I didn't look at it because $65 doesn't look like anything on its own. That's the thing about small, quiet financial commitments. They survive everything. They survive circumstances changing and situations resolving and the original reason disappearing entirely. They just keep renewing month after month because nobody sits down and looks at the full picture. I have thought about that gym membership more than makes any logical sense. I think about it because it's a perfect example of the way things between my son and me had gotten to where they were. Not through anyone's malice, not through conscious exploitation, just through the gradual accumulation of small decisions that nobody examined and the absence of any conversation that would have required us to examine them. That's harder to be angry about than a villain, but it's also harder to fix. Now I want to tell you about the week between when the certified letter was delivered and when my son showed up at my door, because that week is part of the story too, and I don't want to skip it. It was a strange week, unpleasant in a low-grade, constant way, like a headache that doesn't quite become a headache but never fully resolves either. The phone kept producing messages I had to decide whether to engage with. Ellen, my daughter-in-law's mother, left me a voicemail on Monday and another on Wednesday. The Monday one was bewildered and hurt, in a way I found hard to listen to, not because it was unfair, but because it reminded me that the consequences of all of this extended to people who weren't at the center of it. Ellen is a person who loves her daughter and her grandchildren. Her reading of the situation was filtered entirely through what her daughter had told her, which meant it was incomplete, but that doesn't mean she didn't feel what she felt. The Wednesday voicemail was different. Less bewildered, more pointed. I won't repeat it here because it wasn't meant to be repeated. It was meant to wound, and it found a few of its targets. I deleted it. I don't believe in holding on to things like that. Bryce's Facebook message I eventually read in full. He was 32 years old, lived in another state, had met me exactly once at a family gathering 3 years ago for approximately 4 minutes. His message was confident and specific about my moral failings and about what family meant and about how I was choosing money over people. He used the word vindictive twice. I thought about responding. I decided that any response I sent to someone I had met for 4 minutes at a party would be a waste of the words, and I closed the message. My son's friend, the man who called to tell me I was making a mistake, I did talk to briefly. He was genuinely well-intentioned, I think. He'd known my son for years, and he was worried about him, and he thought maybe I could be talked out of whatever I was doing. I told him I appreciated the call, and that his concern for my son was something I shared, and that this was a private family matter that I didn't think needed his involvement. He got a little defensive. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. He didn't call again. The twice daily calls from my daughter-in-law tapered off around day 4. I don't know what caused that. Maybe she'd said everything she wanted to say to my voicemail and had moved on to figuring out next steps, which was the practical thing to do. Maybe someone around her counseled a different approach. I don't know, and I didn't ask. My son sent me a text on day 6. Short. No preamble. I want to talk to you properly. Not like this. I texted back, I'm here when you're ready. He didn't respond that day. He showed up at my door 6 days later. About 12 days after the initial message, my son showed up at my door. No call ahead, no text, just his car in my driveway at 10:30 on a Saturday morning and then the doorbell. I had flour on my hands. I'd been making biscuits. It was one of the few cooking skills Pauline had successfully transferred to me over 40 years of marriage, and I make them most Saturday mornings now out of habit and a faint sense of continuity. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, went to the door, opened it. He looked tired. He'd lost some weight in his face, or maybe I was imagining it. He was wearing a jacket I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago, the dark green one he'd mentioned he liked, and I noticed it because of course I noticed it. You notice those things when you're a parent. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped back back and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my accounting with the legal pad nearly 2 weeks earlier. The biscuit dough was sitting in a bowl nearby. Neither of us mentioned it. I want to tell you something about the morning he showed up, beyond the bare facts of it, because the facts are that he rang my doorbell at 10:30 on a Saturday with no warning, and I had flour on my hands, and I let him in. That's the fact of it. But there's something underneath the fact that I've thought about a lot. He drove 40 minutes to my house on a Saturday morning without calling ahead, and I think about what that means. In our family, in the dynamic we'd been in for years, you called ahead, you scheduled, you made sure everyone was prepared and in position. Nobody just showed up. Showing up without preparation, without a script in place, felt too risky. You might say the wrong thing. You might have the wrong conversation. He showed up anyway. I think that took more out of him than he let on. I think the drive over, the 40 minutes alone in a car without anyone to perform normalcy for, was probably the hardest part. And he did it. And when I opened the door, he just said, "Can I come in?" Which is maybe the simplest and most honest thing he'd said to me in 4 years. So I let him in. He talked for a long time. He told me things I hadn't expected him to say. Not deflections, not negotiations. He told me about his wife's history with her own parents. How her family had a pattern of using gifts as leverage. How generosity in her house growing up was never actually free. How you always found out eventually what it had cost you. He told me she'd brought that fear into their marriage. The idea that someone giving you something without strings was actually impossible, and she'd looked at our arrangement through that lens for years. He told me her parents had made a comment years ago at a dinner he'd attended without me that I controlled him through money. He said he'd never shaken it. He told me he'd let her version of things sit in his head until it started to feel like his version. He told me it was easier to adopt her narrative than to examine it, because examining it would have meant examining himself, and that was harder. He said all of this haltingly, repeating himself, pressing his hands flat on the table like he was trying to hold something in place. He was not good at this kind of conversation. I had never been good at it either. We had that in common, my son and I. He said something near the end that I haven't mentioned yet, and I want to mention it now. He said, "I think I stopped seeing you as a person a while ago. I don't know when exactly it happened, but somewhere in there you became a part of the arrangement instead of my father, and I let that happen because it was easier." He said it simply, not dramatically, like he'd been working up to it in his head for a while and had finally found the right words. I told him I understood more than he probably expected. I told him I'd done the same thing to him in a different direction, that I'd let myself become a part of the arrangement instead of his father, because it was easier for me too. We'd both chosen the version of this relationship that required the least discomfort, and we'd both been living with the results. He nodded. He pressed his hands flat on the table again. He said, "Mom would have fixed this 5 years ago." I said, "Yes, she would have." He said, "I miss her." I said, "Me too." We sat there for a minute without saying anything, just two people sitting at a kitchen table with that truth between them, which is maybe its own kind of presence. Pauline had been the connective tissue of our family in ways neither of us had fully reckoned with. Without her, we drifted into a pattern that felt like connection because it involved regular contact and money changing hands. But it wasn't connection. It was just proximity and finance. She would have had the conversation we needed to have years before we were willing to have it. She would have sat us both down at this very table with coffee and whatever she'd been baking, and she would have said what needed saying in that voice she had that was warm and immovable at the same time. We didn't have her, but we had the table and the burned biscuits and a Saturday morning with nowhere else to be. Sometimes that's what you get, and you have to decide whether it's enough to start with. We decided it was. When he was done talking, I got up and put the biscuits in the oven, poured us both coffee, sat back down and told him I had my own part in all of this, that I had been easier to give money to than to talk to, that I had let that become a pattern because it felt like love even when it wasn't, that I had written checks instead of having hard conversations, and in doing that I had taught him without a single word that my role in his life was financial, that I was a resource, not a person, that I'd done that and I couldn't undo it, but I could stop doing it. I told him what I needed going forward was different from what we'd had. I needed him to talk to me about his life, his work, his marriage, his actual problems, not just when he needed something, not just to maintain the flow of money. I needed to be a person in his life, not a payment method. He said, "I know, Dad." I said, "I need you to know it longer than just this morning." He looked at me, and for a second I saw something in his face I recognized from when he was a teenager. That specific look of a person who has understood something they can't ununderstand. The look that comes right before real change. He almost smiled. Then, yeah, the biscuits burned a little at the edges. We ate them anyway, at the kitchen table, with butter and coffee. And it wasn't comfortable or easy, but it was real. More real than most of the interactions we'd had over the previous 4 years. I want to be honest about what happened after that, because this isn't the kind of story where the kitchen table conversation fixes everything. That's not how things work. You don't have one hard conversation and emerge from it transformed. You have one hard conversation, and then you have another one, and then you have a disagreement, and then a decent phone call, and then a frustrating exchange. And slowly, across months and years, if you're both willing, something different emerges from the wreckage of what you had before. That's what happened. Slowly. Imperfectly. I didn't reverse the cancellations. I want to be clear about that because I know people will wonder. The biscuit conversation didn't change the financial reality. It changed us, a little, incrementally, in the way that real conversations do. But the arrangement was over, and reversing it would have undone the only honest thing we'd managed in years. The house went on the market in January. It sold in February to a young couple I never met, which is usually how these things go. My son and his wife found a rental a town over, smaller than the house, different school district. It required actual conversations between them about their income and their expenses and their priorities, conversations they had apparently never had in the entirety of their marriage. My son told me later that sitting down with a spreadsheet for the first time in his adult life was one of the more clarifying experiences he'd had in years. Not comfortable, clarifying. I helped them move. I rented a truck and drove it myself, which my son protested on the grounds that I was in my 60s and didn't need to be hauling furniture. I ignored him. I showed up at 7 in the morning with the truck and a plan, and we loaded the whole house in 4 hours. His wife was polite in the stiff way people are when they're still working through something but have chosen, at least temporarily, to set it aside. I respected that. She had reasons for the things she believed. They were wrong about me, but they came from somewhere real, and I wasn't going to pretend that didn't matter. My grandson changed schools. That part was hard. He'd had friends at the old school, a teacher he liked, routines that mattered to a 7-year-old in the way that 7-year-olds' routines do. He had a couple of rough months in the new place, coming home quiet, not wanting to talk about it, but he was a resilient kid. He'd always been a resilient kid from the time he was small, and by spring he had a best friend in the new class and had joined the soccer team and was coming home loud again. My granddaughter, who was 5, had one primary concern about the move, whether the new house had a yard. It did. That settled it for her. She found the yard within 10 minutes of arriving and declared it acceptable. She's 5. Everything is either acceptable or unacceptable, and there's no negotiation. That decision didn't transform anything overnight. Repair is slow and frequently awkward, and sometimes you'll have 3 good weeks followed by a conversation that makes you feel like you're back at the beginning and you have to choose again to keep going. We kept choosing to keep going. My son called me a few weeks after the kitchen table conversation with a question about refinancing. They were looking at options, trying to understand whether it made sense to try to buy something again once they'd had time to rebuild their financial footing. He could have called a bank. He called me, not to ask for money, to ask for knowledge, which is a different thing entirely, and the fact that he could tell the difference meant something. We talked about mortgage rates and credit repair and timelines. I gave him the practical information I had. He thanked me. We talked for a few more minutes about other things. He mentioned that my grandson had scored his first soccer goal and the entire team had gone to a frozen yogurt place to celebrate. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things a father and son talk about on the phone. It doesn't sound like much. I know it doesn't. But after 4 years of money as the primary language between us, having an ordinary phone call about soccer and credit scores felt like something I hadn't realized I was missing until I had it back. I think that's usually how you know when a relationship is changing, not the dramatic moments, the ordinary ones. I spent Christmas that year at Bernard's house across the street. His wife had invited me sometime in mid-December, saying there would be family around and they'd love to have me if I didn't have plans. I'd told her I didn't have plans. It turned out to be unexpectedly fine. There was a standing rib roast and a lot of grandchildren I'd never met who accepted my presence with the easy grace that children have when they're warm and there's food involved and the adults in the room seem content. I didn't know anyone particularly well, but I was in a warm house with people who weren't performing anything, and that felt like enough. My son called me on Christmas morning. I was still in my pajamas, drinking coffee, watching the birds at the feeder. He called at 9:17 and we talked for 40 minutes. He told me about my grandson's soccer and my granddaughter's new obsession with drawing horses, which apparently had come out of nowhere and was now consuming her entire creative life. He told me the rental was tight, but manageable. He said the budget app he'd downloaded was, and here's the exact word he used, terrifying in a useful way. I told him I understood that feeling. He almost laughed. At the end of the call, he said, a little awkwardly feeling around for the right way to say it, that he hoped I had a good day. I'm going to, I told him. And then there was a pause, the kind of pause that has weight to it. And he said, I know you would have rather been here, Dad. I'm sorry about that. I said, we'll get there. He said, yeah. We hung up. I sat there with my coffee for a while. The birds were at the feeder. The street was quiet. It was Christmas morning, and I was alone in my house, which was true. But something else was also true. Something I had to sit with for a bit before I could name it properly. My son had apologized. Not because I'd backed him into a corner. Not because he needed something. Just because he meant it. I thought about Pauline. She believed that was possible. She believed it was possible for a long time before I did. She believed my son was capable of real understanding, real growth, even when I wasn't sure. Especially when I wasn't sure. She had more patience for who people were becoming than I had. She could hold the person in front of her and the person they might eventually be in the same hand without losing either one. I like to think I'm getting better at that. We talk now, my son and I. Not every week, but regularly. We talk about things other than money, which is new, and about things other than the grandchildren, which is also new. He calls sometimes just because something happened he wanted to tell me. Once he called because he was frustrated about a situation at work and wanted another perspective, and we talked for an hour about it, and at the end he said it helped. I didn't offer to fix anything or fund anything. I just listened and talked it through with him. That was all he needed. It's usually all anyone needs, and it costs nothing, which is the part that took me the longest to learn. He told me last spring that he'd been keeping a budget for the first time in his adult life. He said it with a kind of quiet pride that I recognized immediately, the pride of a man who has done something for himself on his own terms without a safety net. The pride I felt 40 years ago when I signed my first engineering contract. The pride that comes from knowing that something in your life is genuinely yours. I thought about Pauline when he told me that. I thought, there he is. That's the version of him she always believed was in there. I believe it too. I just needed to stop getting in his way. The thing I've come to understand, and I've had a lot of quiet time to think about this, because one of the things nobody really prepares you for about getting older is how much quiet time you end up with, is that what happened between my son and me wasn't really about a text message. It wasn't about Christmas dinner. It was the result of years of accumulated choices, small and large, made by both of us, each one making the next one a little more inevitable. I gave money because it was easier than giving attention. He took money because it was easier than establishing independence. His wife interpreted generosity as control because that's what generosity had always meant in her family. And none of us ever sat down and talked about any of it because we'd all gotten very comfortable not talking about it. Cause and effect doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes it coils around slowly, and by the time you feel it, it's been tightening for years. There's one more thing I want to say because I've been thinking about it since the whole thing started, and I haven't found a better way to put it. The night I canceled those payments, I was not trying to punish my son. I want to be clear about that because I know how it can look from the outside. I know it looks like retaliation. It looks like a father using the one tool he has to hurt the people who hurt him. I understand why it looks that way, but that's not what it was. Revenge wants the other person to suffer. What I wanted was for the pattern to stop. I'd been part of a dynamic that wasn't good for either of us, and when my son's message made the shape of that dynamic undeniable, I stopped participating in it. That's not punishment, that's consequence. And there's a difference between those two things that matters enormously, even if it's sometimes hard to see from the outside. I stepped out of the way and let reality arrive. The reality was that my son and his wife couldn't afford the life they were living without my support. The reality was that they had never had to reckon with that because I was always there preventing the reckoning. When I stepped back, they had to reckon. And reckoning, as uncomfortable as it is how adults are built. They're okay. More than okay. My son sounds different on the phone now than he did 2 years ago. More solid. Like someone who has found the floor under his own feet for the first time in a while and discovered that it holds. His wife and I are not close. I don't expect that to change quickly. Trust, when it's been broken in both directions, doesn't rebuild overnight. But we are civil. We are managing to be in the same room on the occasions when that's required. That's a start, and I am willing to be patient with a start. My grandchildren are fine. Better than fine. They're exactly who they were. Resilient and funny and interested in everything. My grandson with his soccer and my granddaughter with her horses. They don't carry any of this with them. Children have a remarkable ability to live completely in the present tense. I am working on developing that ability myself. I'm better at it than I was. And if Pauline is somewhere watching all of this, if that's how any of this works, which I don't know and can't know, I think she's giving me that look she had. The amused one. The one that meant you finally figured it out, you impossible man. I hope so. I'm working on it.